All right, well, welcome to 7.3a. So we're in Chapter 7, and we are doing now finding the least common denominator. So we've got 7.3a. This is video 7.3a. This is the first video for 7.3, and we're finding the least common denominator. And later on, we're going to find the least common denominator and convert. So that's going to be 7.3b. But right now, we're going to convert. We're just going to find the least common denominator. So let's see, a lot like rational numbers, rational expressions are going to be very similar. So like rational numbers, in order to add and subtract, that's going to be our goal, is add and subtract these fractions or these rational expressions with polynomials. In order to add and subtract them, we have to have the least common denominator, just like in fractions. And it's really important to have the least common denominator. The least common denominator when we work with rational expressions, in other words, polynomials, because that way we are working with the least amount of work that we have to do to convert our polynomials and our rational expressions with polynomials into simplest term fractions that can be added and subtracted. So right now we're going to take a look at just finding the least common denominator. So we're going to find the least common denominator of a couple different things. We're going to start with some numbers. So if we find, if we've got something like 1/20th and 1/2, if we have to find the lowest common denominator, what we do is we factor everything here, in especially the denominator, in 20th, let's say. And we say, well, 20th can be, 20 can be factored out into 4 times 5, and 4 can be 2 times 2. So our factors then become 2 squared times 5. I've kind of made a mess up here, so I'm going to kind of go around it. I've got a 2 and a 2 and a 5 as my factors for 20, which become 2 times 2 is 2 squared, which is listed right there. 5 is 5 to the first power, or just 5. We could list it as 5 to the first power as well. Now, the other one is eighths, and we have to do the same thing for the eighths. We have to kind of find, and this is just an example. We're going to go through a more formal process later on, but I'm just going to find an idea about how to do this. If we had eighths, we would factor 8 into 4 and 2, and 4 would be 2 squared, or 2 times 2. And now our factors are 2 times 2 times 2, which becomes 2 cubed. And it's important to think about these as not just 2 times 2 times 2, but 2 cubed, because our factor over here becomes, our lowest common denominator is 2 cubed times 5 is 8 times 5 is 40, and that's our lowest common denominator, which is kind of in line with the fact that we've got 20 and we've got to multiply by 2. If we multiply 20 by 2, we get to 40. If we multiply 8 by 5, we'd get to 40, and that's the lowest amount of work that we have to do to convert both of these to a common denominator. So 40ths is our lowest common denominator because it includes every factor here, and it's raised to the highest power that you see it. So let's go and maybe kind of formalize this a little bit. And how do we find the lowest common denominator of rational expressions? This is something that I copied from the book, and I'm going to modify it just a little bit to kind of make it maybe more a little more memorable. So step number 1, just like up here, we've got a factor. Factor denominators, because we're looking for lowest common denominators, so we have to factor denominators. We've got to factor those denominators, which is what we say up here. Step 1, factor denominators completely. Factor denominators, and list them as factors to a power. So step number 2 then says the lowest common denominator is the product of unique prime factors from the denominators, in which each factor is raised to the highest power in which it appears in any denominator. Whew, that's a lot of words. What I'm going to say is that our lowest common denominator includes, lowest common denominator is every factor, or includes every factor from every denominator. Raised to the highest power seen. And I would say that if we're looking for something to add to our study guide, lowest common denominator is found this way. Number 1, factor the denominators. Number 2, lowest common denominator includes every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power that's seen in any denominator. And this is kind of my shorthand. Lowest common denominator is every factor from every denominator to the highest power. So we're going to hear that probably pretty often now really from now on, to find the lowest common denominator. So let's take a look at what that means for some of these. If we've got, if our instructions are find the lowest common denominator, and later on we're going to use this idea of finding the lowest common denominator to add or subtract fractions, either fractions or rational expressions, especially rational expressions. Later on, we're going to have to find the lowest common denominator. So step number 1 was factor. Factor the denominator, and I'll use shorthand here. So factor the denominator. 14 is 2 times 7. 49 is 7 times 7. Whoops, hang on a second. 8 is 4 times 2, or 4 is 2 times 2. And now we can list all these as kind of products of prime factors to powers. So in green, I've got 2 times 2 times 2, that's 2 cubed. In blue, I have 7 times 7, that would be 7 squared. In red, well, I've just got 2 times 7. So step number 1 of our factorization, of finding a lowest common denominator, was to factor our denominator. Step number 2 was to list our lowest common denominator ideas. Lowest common denominator includes every factors multiplied together from every denominator raised to the highest power. All right, so lowest common denominator includes every factor from every denominator raised to the highest power. Let's go and list our lowest common denominators. Lowest common denominator includes every factor. All right, well, I'll go through here and I say, well, I've got to have a 2. I've got to have a 7. I've got to have a 7, which I've got. And we'll take care of the powers soon. I've got to have a 7. I've got to have a 2. 2's there and 7's there. So the blue factor is 7. The green factor is 7. And now we've listed every factor from every denominator, and now we just raise it to the highest power that we've seen it at. 2 is to the first power here, so red is happy with just 1 2. 7 is raised to the first power in red, so over here to the first power, red is happy. But now here we see a 7. The blue factoring has 7 squared, so we've got to raise the 7 to the squared power, to the highest power that we see it. The 2 has to be raised to the third power, because the green has 2 to the third power. Now the red says, well, I've only got 1 2, but if we've got at least 1 2 here, and we do have 1 2, one factor of 2 in our lowest common denominator, red is happy. 7 says, well, I've got 2 7s. I've got to have at least 2 7s, and it has 2 7s there. Red has it says it has to have at least 1 7. We've got at least 1 7 there. And 2, the green says we've got to have 3 2's in our lowest common denominator. And sure enough, we have 3 2's. So here's our rules for finding our lowest common denominator. Number 1, factor, which we did. 2 times 7, 7 squared, 2 cubed. And then we find our lowest common denominator by listing every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power. Every single factor, 2 and 7, raised to the highest power, to the third power, to the second power. This is 2 cubed is 8, 7 squared is 49, and that is 392. That's our lowest common denominator. And there's our lowest common denominator. Let's go through another one. These, to be honest with you, when we start getting away from numbers and we start getting into variables and or polynomials, it seems to get a little easier. So let's go through our list of things that we're doing. Let's see. If we're going to find our lowest common denominator, number 1, we've got to find our lowest common denominator. Lowest common denominator means step number 1, factor our denominators. Step number 2 says lowest common denominator is every factor from every denominator to highest power. Highest. Sometimes my writing is not great. To the highest power. Alright, so there's our listing of what we have to do. So we've got a factor. So step number 1 says factor. Alright. Factor 3x squared times z. Well, 3 times x squared times z. This is a little easier because we've got a factor of 3. We've got an x times x becomes x squared because we're looking for prime factors to the highest power that you see it in the green. And then z is just z. And then we can go to the red and say, well, I've got x squared, or sorry, x to the 5th power. X to the 5th power and y to the 3rd power. And those are both factors because they multiply together. So we've factored, and step number 2 says let's find our lowest common denominator. Lowest common denominator includes every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power that we see it. So what's our lowest common denominator? We list all of our factors. A 3 has to be there. An x has to be there. A z has to be there. An x has to be there. We've got it already. We've got to have y there. We list the y. So we've listed every factor from every denominator, and now we raise it to the highest power that we see it. 3 is to the 1st power, so 3 over here is to the 1st power if we want to write it down there. We don't have to, though. X has to be squared here, but x has to be to the 5th power here, so we have to raise it to the highest power that we see it. X is to the 5th power. Z is to the 1st power, z to the 1st power. There's no z's over here. And then y has to be to the 3rd power. There's no y over here, so y to the 3rd power. And there's our lowest common denominator. And if we make it prettier, we call it 3 x to the 5th, y cubed, z to the 1st power, or just z. And there's our lowest common denominator. Working with these seems to be a lot easier because all we have to do is kind of list all of our factors, because these are all factors. All right, so there it is. This, again, is our most important thing that we're going to take home. What if we're going to find our lowest common denominator? Step number 1, factor the denominator. Step number 2, find our lowest common denominator. Includes every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power. So, let's see. Let's look at this one because we can do this, I think, pretty quickly. Because if we find our lowest common denominator, again, what's our instructions? Find the lowest common denominator. All right, well, number 1, factor. Factor our denominator. Step number 2, find our lowest common denominator. Includes every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power. I don't know why. Highest power. Sometimes highest is hard to write. So there's our instructions. This is the instructions. These are our steps. We got to remember, okay, well, number 1, factor our denominator, and then list our lowest common denominator, every single factor from every denominator to the highest power. So let's go over here and say, what have I got? For my 8, I've got 4 times 2, and 4 is 2 times 2, so my factorization and prime factorization is 2 cubed. If I go to 10, 10 is 2 times 5, and well, I got 2 times 5 for my green factorization. For my red factorization, 15 is, well, 3 times 5. Well, let's go list down our product in prime factorization as 3 times 5. And now let's go, so we've factored our denominator, and now let's list the parts of our lowest common denominator. Includes every single factor. Well, it has to have a 2. It has to have a 2. It's got it over there. It has to have a 5. It has to have a 3. And it has to have a 5. It's there already. And now we've listed every factor from every denominator. Now we raise it to the highest power that we see it. All these are 1s. 2 to the 1st power, 5 to the 1st power, 3 to the 1st power, 5 to the 1st power. And the only one, the highest power that we have to worry about is the 2 cubed. So we have to make our 2 cubed. So that makes our lowest common denominator 2 cubed times 5 times 3, because we factored our denominator, we listed every factor from every denominator, and we raised it to the highest power. So now we make it a little prettier. 2 cubed is 8 times 15. 5 times 3 is 15. 2 cubed is 8. 8 times 15 is 120. And there's our lowest common denominator. And that lowest common denominator allows us to multiply 8 times something to get to 1/20th, 10 times something to get to 1/20th, 15 times something to get to 1/20th as well. And that's the whole idea behind the lowest common denominator. All right, so this is the one I'm going to leave for you. I'm going to say, you guys please do this on your own and say, please find the lowest common denominator here. So what do we have to do? Number one, we've got to factor our denominator. Step number two, we've got to do our lowest common denominator includes every single factor from every single denominator. And I'm kind of putting a skeleton over here because you're going to be working on this one. Someday I'll be able to write highest. All right, so there's our skeleton of what we have to do. So do that over here. Come into class on, well, let's see, tomorrow, and tell me what that lowest common denominator is of 5a cubed b squared times 10a to the fourth b. All right, so tell me what that is. Because we're going to go on to the next page, which is really something a little, to be honest with you, it looks more complicated, but it's simpler. So here's our instructions. Find the lowest common denominator. All right, well, lowest common denominator. What are our steps? Step number one, factor our denominator. Step number two, list our lowest common denominator. Includes every single factor from every single denominator to the highest power. There's a good highest. All right, well, let's factor. And say, what's a squared minus 25? A squared minus 25. We've got to factor that denominator. We've got to remember that there's a difference here. There's a perfect square and a perfect square. A squared is a perfect square. 25 is a perfect square. There's a difference between the two, so we have to say that this is a difference of perfect squares, or difference of squares. And that factors to a minus 5 times a plus 5. So there's our factorization of a squared minus 25. And if we go and factor this 2a minus 10, we've got to say, well, is there a least common denominator that we can pull out, or a greatest common factor out of 2a and 10? Yes, we can call it 2 times whatever's left. 2a divided by 2 is a. Negative 10 divided by 2 is minus 5. And that's our factorization. We can double check by saying 2 times a minus 5 should be 2a minus 10. 2 times a, 2a. 2 times minus 5 is minus 10. There's our factorization for green. All right, so step number one is done. We've factored our denominator. Step number two, we've got to go and find what our lowest common denominator is. Lowest common denominator includes every single factor from every denominator to the highest power. So let's go list the factors. A minus 5 is a factor. A plus 5 is a factor. And 2 is a factor. And a minus 5 is a factor, but we've got it listed here already. So we've listed every factor, we've listed from every denominator, and we go to the highest power. Wait, this is to the first power, to the first power, to the first power, to the first power. Hey, we're done. So if we make it prettier, our lowest common denominator is 2 times a minus 5 times a plus 5. Done. And that's our lowest common denominator for those two fractions, or those two rational expressions. All right. So I'm going to leave you guys with this one. This one's a little more challenging. But again, let's take a look at what our instructions are. Let's take a look and say, well, we've got to find our lowest common denominator. If we have to find our lowest common denominator, what are the steps? Number one, factor the denominators. These are a little more challenging, but here's a greatest common factor out of these two. These I would use for this x squared minus 4x plus 4. I would use, again, we've got to go back to chapter 6, but we've got to use trial and error method for that one. Step number 2 says, list the factors of our lowest common denominator. Every single factor from every single denominator raised to the highest power. And that is what we have to do, and that's all we have to do. Factor our denominator, list everything here from our denominators over here as our lowest common denominator. Oops, sorry. Lowest common denominator. So find that lowest common denominator, bring it into class tomorrow, and we'll see what you got. See you soon.